Well, welcome everyone. My name's Dan Lewin. I'm the CEO of the Computer History Museum. Welcome to the program tonight. On behalf of all of our volunteers, of which there are many, our members, our trustees, and the staff, we'd like to welcome you to the program tonight, so thanks for coming. I would also like to make reference to the fact that these programs are made possible by the generous donations of our trustees and benefactors and our members. And how many people in the audience are members, may I ask? I love that. And if you're not, given the choice which you all have, please opt in. Go to the website, become a member. It'll be helpful for all of us. So thank you for that. I was in the corporate sector for 40 years before coming here to the museum, and had the good fortune of being part of the founding team that built the original Macintosh at Apple a long time ago. I won't say how long, but most of you know because you're here. So I was one of the first 10 people in that group. And I ended up my last years at Microsoft, first working for Steve Ballmer and then for Satya, who's running it, and then Brad Smith. And I can tell you those two things bookended 5 startups. And while technology is really important, culture is equally, if not more important in the end if you want to build a company or an organization that lasts. And so I'm really pleased about the program tonight, because one of the things that Ben has done in his book is to really take a pen and a thoughtful mind to decoding some of the issues that make culture real and important. And I'll dwell on that just for a moment, because here at the museum we're going through a process of re-envisioning what this institution will look like 10 years from now. And the essence of it is the summary of the following 3 words. When you say computer, history, and museum, you end up with 3 initials: computing, humanity, and meaning. And then we flip it around and say, what does it mean to be a human in a world of computing? Because life as we know it doesn't exist without computing. And so we really are talking about culture, how people communicate. And it's part of our mission to use that lens as a lens through which we help decode technology with present-day topics that matter to people, and to then put people first. And what we're seeing, if you look at the website, is humanity forward. So people first, decoding the technology. And at the end of the day, it's about the culture and putting these machines to work for us. So I thank Ben for the book, and I thank you all for coming. And I'd like to introduce Marguerite Gong-Hancock, who's the founding executive director of the Exponential Center, who will introduce the program. Marguerite?
Thanks, Daniel. Well, good evening. For tonight's program, recently in the news, there have been many stories about real or perceived significant problems for culture in business companies. And Ben Horowitz, co-founder of Andreessen Horowitz, and also tech entrepreneur, asked himself what he could do to help business leaders build effective culture. And so he's here tonight to share his answer and concrete lessons from current companies, as well as a surprising array of models, ranging from Genghis Khan and samurai to leaders of Haiti's slave revolt and a prison gang. As is tradition here at CHM, I'd like to introduce Ben with 5 numbers. 20, the age Ben was when his rap career ended. 35 cents, the share price for Opsware at the bottom, which equaled half the cash they had in the bank. 1.6 billion, the number of dollars Opsware sold for in 2007, and $10 billion under management today at Andreessen Horowitz. Last but not least, 30, the number of years married to wife Felicia, who's here in the audience today. That's Ben. We also have here tonight a seasoned tech writer as moderator for this conversation. Sunil Chokshi is editor-in-chief at Andreessen Horowitz, where she has built the editorial operation and the very popular podcast. Previously, she played pioneering roles in content both at Wired as well as Xerox PARC. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome tonight to Ben and Sunil. So glad to have you here. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you so much for that intro. And we're so glad that you all are out here at the Computer History Museum. I'm so glad that we're doing this here because we're here to talk about Ben's best-selling new book, What You Do Is Who You Are, which is really about culture. And we all know it's important, but no one really tells you how to shape it, how to set it, even how to fix it when things go wrong. And what I love about Ben is he's not only a builder, but a bridger of cultures. And that's honestly how I think about why it's so significant that we're sitting here at the Computer History Museum, because this represents the heart of Silicon Valley, which itself has been going through lots of cultural change. And so the first question I want to ask you, Ben, about your book, just with that quick context, is a very obvious, straightforward question to actually define culture, because you say it's not what, corporate values, it's not perks, but then what is it? Like, let's have that foundation.
Yeah, and one of my kind of favorite semi-definitions of culture, or pieces of it, is from The Way of the Warrior, the Bushido, which is the ancient code of the samurai. And they say a culture is not a set of beliefs, it's a set of actions. And I think which is where the title of the book came from. So it's not what you believe, it's not what's in your heart, it's not what you tweet, it's what you do, that's who you are culturally. But when you get into a company context, it ends up being really small, subtle things that determine your culture, determine the way you treat each other, determine the way you treat your business partners and your customers, and they're very kind of amorphous, nearly invisible things. So when you do you return that phone call in an hour, in a day, in a week? Never. Do you go home at 5 or at 8? When you do a business deal, it's about the partnership or the price. All these things, that's your culture, and they're not in your KPIs or your OKRs or your mission statement or any of that. And then, how do you move and shape them? Because, and the conventional kind of method, I can tell you, doesn't work, which is, we'll bring in the HR consultants and we'll have an offsite and we'll put a bunch of values on the board, and then once a year in people's performance reviews, we'll say, does he have integrity?
What are those values again?
When the real thing is, like, how do you know if he returned the phone call? You don't even know if he got the phone call. And so, like, how do you get that behavior going in the direction that you want it? And that's, what the book is about. And that was really the hardest, most difficult thing for me to learn as CEO. So I thought it was a good thing to write a book about.
Well, it's funny because I think of the book, we're sitting again in Computer History Museum, I think of the book as culture as code. And you actually use a lot of words, and I'll read some of them out loud. I mean, you know it because you wrote it, but you describe culture as code, you talk about programming culture, you talk about reprogramming culture, you talk about how it's hard to debug, how you have to, every culture has bugs. I mean, you basically use a lot of digital words. But yet, your examples in the book...
My lost youth as an engineer.
It's like, exactly, how do you engineer the culture? But your examples are all analog. I mean, they go back over 1,000 years. And frankly, the most recent one was maybe 20 years ago, and it was from prison, where there wasn't a lot of technology. And so one question I wanted to ask you about is culture as code. And
JPay, that's what the prison email system is, JPay.
It's all JPEGs?
It's very bad. No, it's JPay, jail pay. Because you pay for every email.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
It's a really bad system.
There's no technology, and yet you also describe culture as code, and specifically the example that comes to mind is the samurai. And what drew you to that example of culture, and why?
Well, it's interesting. I actually came to it, the first example is the Haitian Revolution, which is an amazing story because it's the only successful slave revolt in human history. And it's a story of how Toussaint Louverture reprogrammed slave culture to be kind of military culture, which is an incredibly difficult job for many reasons. But the tragedy of the Haitian Revolution is they lost the culture almost the instant they won the revolution, and it was a kind of crazy story about what happened to Toussaint. He was double-crossed by Napoleon and thrown in jail in a diplomatic meeting, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines took over and went a completely different direction. But the samurai code lasted, at least 1,000 years, depending on how you count it. Because if you go to Tokyo today, you still see a lot of samurai culture. Like, it is there. It's amazing. And so I really wanted to kind of go through all the things they did to make it last so long, and amazingly so.
So with the samurai code lasting so long, it's another programming word. It was a system. And I have to ask about this because on one hand in the book you say, hey, you can't have platitudes, but it was a system of words. Like they had a code with 8 principles. And so kind of how do you reconcile that?
Well, I mean, like words and actions, you know, you can describe your actions in words. It's not, I'm not anti-word.
Yeah.
You know,
That'd be a terrible position to take.
Not like that. So, yeah, the system was very interesting. So one of the things with culture that you run into is things that you think that you want to put in your culture can get weaponized against you. And they tell a story in the book about slack. So Stuart Butterfield early on had this cultural value, empathy. And seems like a good one. And his intention with empathy was, look, I don't want people to just state their point of view. I want them to understand the other person's point of view thoroughly and then decide if they still want to argue the point, as opposed to just going at each other. And that was the idea behind empathy. Well, it wasn't defined, you know, where the boundaries were and so forth. And so what ended up happening is, you know, employees would be getting their performance reviews and the manager would say, well, I need you to improve here and there. And they'd be, well, like, you're in violation of the culture. You're not being empathetic. And so he was like, okay, got to get rid of that value. That's not going to work. And the samurai were like amazing, and it developed over a very long time, but it's amazing how they had sort of points and counterpoints and where the kind of, how the virtues worked in a system that would govern itself. So for example, you know, they were an honor culture, and which actually there's some of that in prison too, but
yeah.
But honor culture meaning like if somebody like dissed you or like insulted you, they had to go. Like that was it, because that insult was really, could have been a diagnostic to say, is this guy weak? Can I, you know, besmirch his honor and get away with it? Because if I can do that, I can probably stab him in the head or rob him or whatever. And so in samurai code, like somebody does that, you're going to die. And there's a really kind of great story in the Hagukari about a samurai who has a flea on his shoulder. And another person says, excuse me, you have a flea on your shoulder. And the samurai cuts his head off. And you go, wow, that was like a pretty harsh response. And they ask the samurai, why'd you cut his head off? He's like, look, I'm not an animal. I don't have fleas. Don't call me that. And so when you have a kind of a virtue like that, you need something to balance it. And, you know, one of the things that they did is really establish a very elaborate system of how they treated each other in this virtue known as politeness. And politeness and if anybody's been to Japan, you will know that, like, if you come from Japan and come here, it must be a horrible experience because they're so beautifully polite. It's an art form in Japan, still from samurai. And politeness means the best way to show someone love and respect. And respect is very, very important because, you know, you don't want to say they're an animal with a flea. And it's really, I mean, it's everything to how you bow, to how you set up the tea ceremony, to every aspect of how you make somebody maximally comfortable so that they feel how you feel about them. But, right, if that was fake, just so you didn't get your head chopped off, then that really wouldn't be good either. So one of the things in the code is politeness without veracity is empty. So it has to be honest. It has to come from the right place. It has to be true. And so these are the kinds of ways that they created a system that built a much kind of stronger and long-lasting culture than Stuart had with empathy. Although he's very good at culture. I don't want to pick on Stuart. He works hard at it, but, you know, he recognized the fact that he had that problem.
That is honestly my favorite example from the book because you describe this interlocking system of 8 values in the Bushido Code, and the example you gave that you have patience.
Virtues.
Oh, virtues.
They did them.
Let's talk about the difference
They didn't just
between
put them
that.
on the wall.
Right. I know you're actually trying
Virtue is what you do.
Well, let's actually, you
Yeah.
are trying to rebrand the word values into virtues. Tell me about that.
Well, not so much. It's not so much a rebranding. It's a different thing. A value is what you believe, what you want to be, what you aspire to. A virtue is what you do. And so, I think from a chief executive perspective in a company, you want to think through not just what you want, but how you're going to get it. And that, when you talk about culture, people, when they think about culture, just go, well, here's what I want, and then I'll just tell people it in all hands, and then I'll get it.
And then you'll get it.
And that never happens. Like, then you know what your culture is? Hypocrisy. Because I have all these values on the wall, and I don't do any of them.
Yeah, you don't want that.
So it's trying to kind of move the mindset into how do you do it? Like, what are the mechanisms? What are the mechanics?
What do you think the power, I'm an editor, so I have to ask this. What do you think the power of storytelling is then in kind of disseminating and sharing that culture? In fact, one of the lines in your book is that stories and sayings define cultures.
Sure.
And so I have to ask you what the difference is between the story then and those sort of hypocritical value statements on a wall. Like, what power does story have?
Yeah, so, well, I'll give you an example. Well, let's stay with the samurai for now.
My favorite.
So there's a great story. So one kind of really powerful cultural virtue is loyalty. And then there's kind of a question, okay, well, like, how do you show its importance? How do you kind of make that stick? And one way is, either in a company or in an ancient Japanese warrior society, you can do that through a story that's so compelling that people literally can't get it out of their head. And so here's a story I'm going to tell you that you won't be able to get out of your head.
Oh, no.
So there was this lord in ancient Japan. His name was Lord Soma. And, in those days, the status symbols weren't what we have today. There was no, Hermes or Louis Vuitton or that kind of thing, or Ferrari. But one of the things that they had that, like, everybody was kind of proud of if they had a good one was their genealogy. Mm-hmm. And it was on scrolls, and it'd be written out in generations of who your ancestors were, and kind of the more you knew who you were, like, that was a big thing. And Lord Soma had the best genealogy in all of Japan, and had a name. It was the Chaiken Marikoshi. And this, and then working for him was a samurai who was like just a mediocre guy. He's clumsy, always getting things wrong, messing things up. But the Lord Soma had a really good feeling about him because, he was always sincere and loyal. And so one day, the Lord Soma's house catches fire, and it's engulfed in flames. I mean, it is like burning down, and there's no way to deal with it or put it out. And his samurai, and then inside the house was the Chaiken Marikoshi, his genealogy. And, he was torn up about it, but, he knew it was gone. And the samurai said, I'm going in and getting it. I haven't been, the best, but I'm going to do this for you because I know how important it is to you. And Lord Soma said, no. All that's going to happen is you're going to die. You're not going to get it. You're going to die. It's going to be over. No way. Samurai runs into the house, engulfed in flames. Lord Soma's shocked. He's horrified. He doesn't want to lose this guy. They watch the house just burn to the ground, and they know he's dead. And they go in, and sure enough, they're looking for him, and he sees him, and he's face down, all burnt to a crisp. And it's horrible, but then they notice that he's in a pool of blood. And they're going, why is he in a pool of blood? He just ran into a fire. And they turn him over, and there's a slit in his stomach. And they open the slit, and inside it is the genealogy. He cut himself open, put the genealogy in, and saved it. And it was known from that day as the blood genealogy. And everybody knew that even if you were mediocre, if you had that kind of loyalty, you could be great. So that was the story. Yeah.
That's incredible, and I am sure
you guys are going to remember that one.
No one's going to forget it, and I am sure everyone in this room is wondering, quite honestly, why are all your stories so far so violent? I'm wondering that right now, too. I want to know.
I think I can only answer that with another violent story. So, let me tell you the story. So This is also in the book. And some of these stories, like the stories on prison, some of them I got before I was actually like writing the book.
Yeah.
Like it's just me and Shaka in the backyard, and I'm barbecuing, we're drinking beer, and like he tells me these stories, and I'm like, wow. So when you hear it, just think that's how I heard it. So Shaka, who's in the book, he went to jail for a murder he did commit. He was in jail 19 years, 7 years in solitary confinement. But his first day, this story is about his first day in jail, so in prison. Him and a group of guys are in quarantine, which is kind of where they keep you until they put you in general population. They come out into general population. Very first day, they're in the recreational area, and a prisoner walks up to another prisoner and stabs him in the neck with a shank, pulls the shank out. The prisoner bleeds to death, dies. The other prisoner throws the shank in the trash and walks into the cafeteria and has a sandwich. And Shaka said, all the prisoners are looking like, where in the hell are we at? And Shaka said, and I had to ask myself, could I do that? And I said, wait a minute. You murdered a guy to get in here. You did do that. And he said, oh, no, Ben, I didn't do that. He said, I was dealing drugs. One of my customers came. He was supposed to come by himself. He brought another guy. The other guy's in the back seat of the car. I'm already traumatized because I had been shot like 18 months earlier. This guy in the back of the car is supposed to stay in the back of the car. I told him to stay in the back of the car. He opens the door. He comes out. He comes at me real aggressive. I react. I had a gun in my pocket. I shot him. That's what I did. This guy spent 2 weeks taking a 2-liter bottle and filing it into a shank. Then he decided, am I going to stab this guy in the stomach and wound him, or am I going to stab him in the neck and kill him? And he decided he's going to stab him in the neck and kill him, kills him, and keeps it moving to the chow hall and has a sandwich. I couldn't do that. But I had to ask myself, could I do that? Because that's what it took to survive here. And that is new employee orientation. That's getting indoctrinated. You guys laugh. I'm about to explain to you why the book is so violent.
I'm glad you're answering that.
That's how you get oriented into such a violent culture with an experience like that. That happens in companies. People join a company. First thing they do, first thing all of you did when you joined a company, who's successful here? Who's the person everybody looks up to? What's their behavior like? Oh, that guy's making all the money. He's got the big job. He's the one, the golden boy. Oh, and he just took credit for her work? Oh, that's what I have to do to succeed here. Yeah. That's cultural orientation. That's way higher impact than the value statement. And I have conversations with CEOs all the time. I'm like, look, you have to take onboarding seriously. You have to take new employee orientation seriously. You have to train your managers and your people on like what's expected of them behavior-wise in the culture from day one. And you know what they do? They don't listen to me. So I needed a real story that they would remember and understand that would get them to do the right thing. So and a lot of the examples in the book, because culture, it feels very invisible. You're like, well, why do I have to do that? Like, I don't want to, like, I see that person doing something wrong, but it's not that wrong, and I don't want to hurt their feelings by calling them on it. But you're not looking at the knock-on consequences, the knock-on cultural consequences that you're setting up by not addressing it. And so a lot of what the book is about is, can you recognize culture? So a lot of the examples are things that people are not familiar with. Yeah. And the reason for that is nobody can see their own culture. Like, that's just my way of doing things. It's just like the right way to do things. It's what good people do. Like, that's my culture. That's my behavior. Well, like, maybe it's not, but you can't see it because it's you. But you can see prison culture. You can see slave revolt culture.
And it can
these kinds of things, yes.
And that's something to borrow from and think about and kind of riff on in your own way. I want to let people know that Shaka is actually a wonderfully kind, empathetic person.
No, he's amazing. Well, one of the great stories in the book is how he transformed not only his own culture from that like super violent culture, but also the culture of the Kalanick, which was a gang he ran. And I know a lot of the guys, his guys that got out and You know, it's an amazing transformation that somebody could do that.
I want to ask you about that because for me, you know, I know Shaka because he's a friend of yours, and both, actually, just a plug for this, Ben and Shaka co-host a podcast series on our podcast called Hustle and Tech, which is guides to technology for everyone. You can find that on our website. But what's really amazing is that in the book, the story was about how he took a group of outcasts and built a more cohesive team. And that's how you described it in the book.
Yeah.
For me, I wondered, coming at it from, again, this theme of the vantage point of Silicon Valley, could a parallel be drawn that, because I was sort of like, why is it, I understand what you're saying about the, you know, using examples that are shocking and strong that you can learn from, but part of me was like, why is there a jail example in a book about business culture? And so then I wondered, well, maybe can we draw an analogy between a group of outcasts, like technologists, like in this room, and they can do the same thing, and we can draw lessons from that? Or, I don't know. I mean, is that too far a stretch?
Well, so I have this, like, you know, kind of goofy, whatever, comedy, heartwarming comedy with like prison guys, outcasts coming together or something. Look, so let me tell you where the analogy doesn't work, and then where it works. So, you know, people in Silicon Valley, some people may be outcasts. They may have like not fit in, you know, as a kid, and you know, spent more time with the computer or what have you. People get to prison very often because they're really severely abused, beaten as kids, raped as kids.
Yeah.
And so the thing about that prison culture, or prison, that I thought was very instructive was, you know, we can take culture for granted here because when you hire someone, you can expect certain things. You know, you can expect them to be on or reasonably on time for their interview. You know, you can expect them to be literate. You can expect them to, you know, there's just a lot of cultural things that you can take for granted.
Like more functional things, yeah.
Yeah, whereas in prison, you know, there's really nothing you can take for granted, including things like literacy and so forth. So when you go through the way Shaka built the culture of the Kalanics, he really had to start from first principles. And oftentimes, and I'll give you one example, like sometimes in a culture, in a company, you've got to do that same thing.
Yeah.
So there's, you know, one of the things that Shaka did to kind of create loyalty is, you know, he just had the guys spent a lot of time together, eating together, working out together, and it was required to be a member. And these things, just that proximity and the nature of the meal, and how they did it and so forth, kind of built the culture. So I had an issue, or in one of my portfolio companies, Nation Builder, and the CEO, Leah Andreessen, she calls me up one day and she's like, Ben, like like our cash collections are always like late and like not 100%. And I said, well, you have like big customer satisfaction issues? She's like, no, like we're just not collecting the money. And she's like, but I tell them, you know, like we need to collect the money, and like it never happens, and I don't get it. And I was like, well, you know, you have to start from first principles. And I took her through what Shaka did, and I said, like, this is how we're going to apply it here. I want you to hold a meeting every day with the cash collections team. Every day, 8 in the morning, everybody comes to work like we're having a meeting.
Create the urgency.
And in that meeting, the very first thing that I want you to say is, where's my money? And then what you're going to find out is they're going to have all kinds of weird things, reasons why they can't get you your money, and they're all going to be very easy to fix because it's a cultural problem, not an actual problem. And so sure enough, she calls me up after the first day. She's like, you're not going to believe it. You know what one of the biggest things is? We have an email that we send to collect the cash, an auto email, that's really poorly written. And I'm like, well, why haven't we fixed the wording? And they're like, well, we don't know how to do that. And I'm like, no, it's not a big company. And so she every day has this meeting and works through it. And like pretty soon they were, you know, collecting literally twice as much cash as they had been previously. And it was just a culture change. But it was a culture change taken from a prison example. Yeah. And that's, and because you can't make cultural assumptions when you're in prison, so often CEOs make cultural assumptions they shouldn't. And so that, you know, a lot of those techniques end up being very valuable.
I love I love that you brought up first principles because I'm fascinated by first principles type thinkers. I think some of the greatest CEOs, scientists, innovators are first principles thinkers. And one thing I often wonder, I always ask myself this when I, observe the evolution of technology and innovation is, are there maybe two camps of people who can be first principles thinkers and some who can't? And in one of the common Silicon Valley folklore story of Reed Hastings, CEO of Netflix, you tell this briefly in the book, of how he wanted to pivot the Netflix business from DVD to streaming.
He would say he didn't want to pivot it. He said the plan was always to be a network.
Oh, right.
The original network
that.
was high latency latency, high bandwidth, CDs. It took a week, so high
you're
latency.
Right. No, you're right.
But you could deliver a whole movie, so high bandwidth. And he wanted to evolve the network, in his view, from the outset to a streaming service. Yeah.
So you're exactly right. I shouldn't use the word pivot because it is about. That's even more powerful, frankly, from a first principles perspective, that he had the vision up front and the confidence to know that I'm going to pace myself by doing the DVD business before I do the streaming business. But then he built a successful DVD business, and then he kicked out the leaders of his DVD business from the room when they were talking about the streaming business, which felt like a very bold first principles move. It's Silicon Valley folklore. You tell the story in your book. I read that, and I was like, would you really advise your CEOs to do that? Like, was there something about him uniquely that he could make such a bold move? Or is this some really advice that people in this room should actually go translate into their work?
It was actually analogous to the move that Toussaint Louverture made in the Haitian slave revolt. So,
tell us who Toussaint Louverture is.
So Toussaint Louverture is the leader of the, as I said, the only successful slave revolt in human history. And one of the things he did, so there were a lot of, he was obsessed with culture, and one of the things that, to achieve his goal of he wanted to move from a kind of a broken slave culture to a world-class military, and not only military, but like societal culture, because he thought Haiti could be a first-class country. And one of the decisions he made just to make that priority clear, because like the default culture in a slave revolt is revenge, a revenge culture. When it came to the decision of what to do with the plantation owners, the slave owners, he could have executed them, he could have seized the land, he could have done a lot of things. He actually left them in place, let them keep the plantations, but said he had to pay the workers as opposed to have them as slaves. And in order to facilitate that, he lowered their taxes. So that was a decision to set the culture of, to set it away from revenge and towards kind of reconciliation and caring about the economy and caring about the go forward. Reed had basically the same kind of an issue, which is he wanted to get to streaming. His big fear was that a pure streaming company would come along and he would be stuck in the DVD business. And he couldn't figure out how to change the culture to do that. And then one day he said, what we have to do is, even though the DVD business is 100% of the revenue, like imagine that, 100% of the revenue, I'm going to let everybody know that streaming's more important. And the way he did it is he kicked all the DVD people out of the executive staff meeting. And anybody who knows about companies knows that's a meeting everybody wants to be in, that executive staff meeting. So like, that's going to really hurt feelings. But, when he did it, it wasn't like Reed was so great that he got to do it and people would be okay with it. He knew they'd be mad, but like he was just willing to take that because the principle was so important. And the same way, and people were mad in the Haitian Revolution when Toussaint did that, but they were working towards something, a higher cultural principle.
And I love how you described it as creating a shocking rule that sort of does that kind of a reset. One recurring theme I noticed in the book, and for those who haven't read it, this is just something that I think people in marketing and brand talk about too, which is the power of the why. And I noticed almost every other chapter, every other sentence, every other paragraph, you kept emphasizing this message: the why matters more than the what. The why matters, the why matters. And it seems obvious on the surface, but I actually really want you to explain to me and share with us why the why is so important.
So I'll give you two very different examples. One is, well, we'll do an Andreessen Horowitz example. That way I won't pick on.
A16Z.
Yeah, A16Z. So one of the things that we wanted in the culture from the outset was we wanted to respect the entrepreneur and the entrepreneurial process. Now, there's not a venture capitalist in the world who won't say that. Like everybody wants. Like, who doesn't like the entrepreneurs of the business? Of course you want to respect them, of course. But there's a big cultural force that screws that up in venture capital, which is this dynamic. I have the money. You want the money. In order to get the money, you got to come see me and ask for the money, and then I get to decide whether you get the money. So that could make a person disrespectful. And I'll tell you what it does, because anybody here raise venture capital money?
Few people.
How often did the VC show up on time for that meeting? Okay.
And no one's raising their hand.
You know, and why is that? Well, like they say it, but they don't believe it. You know, they want to do it, they aspire to it, but it's a value, not a virtue. And so we had I knew this was going to be a problem for us. So I set a rule early on, which was, if you're late to a meeting with an entrepreneur, that's fine, but you owe me $10 a minute. And, oh, you have to go to the bathroom? No problem, $50. Oh, you had a really important phone call on the deal we all want to close? No problem, $100. And people would come to me and they'd go, why?
Why?
Why am I paying you to work here? Like, I'm working hard. Like, why am I paying you to work here? I'm like, look, because I need you to know how important and valuable an entrepreneur's time is when they're trying to build a company, which is like the hardest thing to do that I know of. And you're not going to waste any of their time if you're here. Like, we're just never, ever, ever going to do that. You got to plan when you go to the bathroom. You got to plan when you have that phone call. And I know you can do it, because if you were getting married, you wouldn't be 5 minutes late to the altar.
Better not.
So you would have gone to the bathroom already. But the reason they have to, every time somebody's got a plan, when they use the restroom, when they make their phone calls and so forth, which is every day at the office, they have to say, why am I doing this? Oh, I remember why, because like we respect entrepreneurs and what it means to build a company. And so that's a kind of technique to move the culture, right?
Yeah.
A different example.
By the way, before you do the different example, I said to tell everyone in the room, it's really funny because Andreessen Horowitz, since you gave that A16Z example, they actually formally call those breaks bio breaks, which is such a weird rebranding. But okay, so they actually schedule in bathroom breaks into the schedule. But anyway, onto your other example. I hate that phrase, by the way.
Well,
Can we just call them bathroom breaks?
I think people were trying to be polite because bathroom is such a dirty word.
I guess it kind of is. Anyway, you were going to say another.
Yeah, so a different one. One of the very tricky things to do. Ethics turns out to be really tricky in a company, and it's funny because people, I make fun of Dara at Uber for saying like, we're going to be ethical. Our new corporate value is just do the right thing. Period.
Yeah.
It's like, what the hell is the right thing? It actually turns out to be fairly subtle much of the time. So in a company, you could imagine, okay, we made promises to all the employees about what their stock was going to be worth, and to the investors about like the numbers we were going to hit, or to Wall Street about the numbers we were going to hit, and like we live up to our commitments. Oh, and then in order to make the number, we got to get this deal. In order to get this deal, they need this feature, but they need it in a quarter, and we're not going to deliver for a year. So is it ethical to whip the quarter and have lied to all the investors and the employees, or is it ethical to stretch the truth to the customer and like get the money? Well, you better be clear on that, and you better get to some kind of higher principle than do the right thing. And so a great example of this is in the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint. So this is a war over sugar. So, and it's the British Army, the Spanish Army, the French Army, and the slave army all fighting for control of this colony. And so it is the most mercenary kind of endeavor that you could ever imagine, because it's literally over sugar. And basically in that kind of environment, and pillaging is just generally accepted in warfare anyway. And so all of the European armies are letting their guys pillage all they want. And Toussaint makes the decision that he's going to not allow any pillaging in the slave army because you can't fight for liberty if you're taking people's liberty. That was what he said. Like, you can't do that and get to this principle that we're fighting for. And it was an amazingly powerful thing because, the stories, some of the stories in the book, but the story would be of like the Spanish army going in, setting the plantation on fire, killing all the animals, robbing everybody, raping the women on the plantation, and then the slave army would show up starving and half naked, and they would not touch a thing. No violence, no pillaging, no nothing. And the knock-on effect of that ethic was that Toussaint had the support of the locals, including the white women in the colony, who referred to him as father, like amazingly. This is a slave running a revolution against the French and against the Europeans, and got to that level of loyalty. And it was really, he didn't say do the right thing, because the right thing is pillage. You pillage, the guys get paid, they fight harder, they win the war, you end slavery. Like, that seems like pretty legit.
Yeah.
So you can't just say do the right thing. You have to say, here's what we're doing and here's why we're doing it. And that's why I emphasize the why.
The power of the why. Yes. I have two follow-ups on this, and I want to actually shift gears to maybe more practical techniques based on these wonderful stories and principles and violent stories as well. So one thought on that is that in the Dara example and the values and the why the why matters, I also read it and heard it a little bit as maybe mistakes of omission are more important than mistakes of commission, that what you don't say is more important than what you do say. Mm-hmm. And so then I wondered, like, practically, does that mean as someone in this room, for instance, wants to figure out their code, their Bushido for their company, do they start with what they're not? Or is there room for them to figure out what they are? Like, how does that sort of play out practically?
Well, no, I do think, one, like, the universe of what you're not is too big.
Yeah, sure.
But here's the thing that is true in every culture is, and this is the thing that Toussaint did so effectively, but you have to make ethics explicit.
Yeah.
If it's, oh yeah, we're going to do the right thing. Oh yeah, like it's going to be,
don't do evil.
Like, yeah, don't be evil. That's just not good enough. And great example of this is Uber under Travis. So, like, a lot of times Travis will get criticized for building a bad culture or broken culture or this and that and the other, but he actually had 99%, maybe the best defined, strongest, most exciting culture in Silicon Valley. And if you read the original values that he had,
it's in the book.
Always be hustling, super pump, toe stomping, whatever. Like they were all like super, like they were really creative, well-crafted, energizing kind of set of principles that they worked on. But he went way beyond that. They really trained people on them. They had Uber University, and they trained people on the culture, and it really stuck. Like, he stuck it, and it worked.
It worked.
They were, and I would say probably the most powerful virtue that he had, or the one that really kind of defined the company, was competitiveness. They were like massively competitive and really great at that. But what he did not do is he didn't say where the line was. So he didn't make any ethics were just like unstated completely. And so a lot of people would interpret that competitive virtue to be like whatever at all costs, he even said #winning, right? And so when Susan Fowler joined the company, if you kind of break down her story, it's really interesting because she gets sexually harassed her first day on the job by her manager in writing. Like, she snapshots it, sends it to HR. Now, anybody who knows anything about HR law knows if you get any kind of complaint, let alone one in writing with proof,
Yeah.
you have to investigate it. Like that's not like good practice, that's the law.
That's the law.
Yeah, you just have to do that. Everybody in HR knows that. But this HR person said, oh, that manager's a high performer, so like we can move you, but like we're not doing anything. And that's what like caused her, or that was like one of the things that triggered her blog post. There's no way like Travis wanted that manager to do that. It's just like a dumbass thing to do. Like even if you didn't care about sexual harassment,
Yeah.
like that's idiotic. That's ridiculous. But when you don't kind of counterbalance the culture, if you don't say what the ethical line is, which we won't cross, particularly in business, because every conversation you have is how do we make the number, how do we get better, how do we get more customers, how do we grow the user base, all that. And so if you don't have any countermeasure on that you talk about out loud, then it can run away from you like very hard and very fast. And so that's why when you talk about what not to do, it's really like, where is the ethical line in this company?
Yeah.
And then particularly in Uber's case, it was tricky because they were flirting the law on a lot of things. So the law wasn't even the line, right? Because they're challenging the regulation, the laws of the land in place. And so what is the line? Definitely not something that, every employee would just figure out on their own.
I loved that you described that in the book, because one of the things that I think is a through line through the book is this idea that the very strength you have is also your weakness, and that it's all a matter of difference of degree, not a difference of kind, which I think is such a powerful idea, because there's a fuzzy area between ethics and law, the yellow and the red, strength, weakness. So it's kind of on a continuum. I do have one question for you about the Uber example. I'm just curious about it because I love a comeback story.
Yeah.
And I love the idea that you can change. Do you think that Uber could have, that Travis himself could have led that change at Uber, or that they needed to bring an outside person, or that he could have come back like 10 years later like Steve Jobs at Apple on his second time? I guess my question is, can the same person actually make that change of a culture, or does it have to come from the outside?
Yeah, so look, I think that Travis could have done it, but Travis would have had to change, if that makes sense. So, right, when Shaka changed the prison culture, which he set in place a super violent culture, and I go through it in the book, it couldn't change until he changed. And I think that, with Travis, he may be changed now, but he didn't change then. And I don't think he ever saw the lack of explicit ethics as the problem. I think he saw it as a series of, want to be at the getting the medical records from the woman in India, or like the sexual harassment, or, the whatever hell application that where they hacked Louverture. Like all of those things were individual incidents. They weren't systematic, I think, in his mind. So like, unless you believe it's systematic, and
right.
I go through the story in the book where they have the confrontation with the Nation of Islam, where Shaka realized that it was systematic. The violence was systematic, and that's when he changed, and that's when they changed.
And he turned his whole group, the gang of the Kalanics, around.
Yes. And I think that that's very unusual and difficult to do. There are other things where there's a competency issue, or like, so, there's a lot of Boeing in the news lately on the 737. And I think anybody who's been in a company knows that there were people in Boeing that knew that thing wasn't safe. Like, there's no question there were engineers that knew it wasn't safe, and I think it's come out even that they told the CEO it wasn't safe.
Yeah.
But somewhere in the culture, whatever it was, being on time with the product release or earnings or whatever became more important than safety. And in a place like Boeing, where lives are on the line, like, you probably can't have a leader that lets that stand culturally. So in that case, I would probably say, I think they're keeping him in place, but I think in that case, I would probably say you have to remove him because you have to shock the system hard enough to reset the culture to the point where they value safety over whatever it was that they were valuing.
if he or someone else in this position who's trying to turn around or reset their culture did actually become, to your point, self-aware, what would they have to do then to then communicate that to their company? Or how do they sort of convey that this is a shift?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's very, very hard and detailed work. Like, I don't make light of it, and probably the best example is kind of, Shaka in the book going through, like, incident by incident and not, and changing every single decision they made to defuse the violence and come up with, nonviolent solutions to things that didn't require violence, which was, I hate to say read the book, but like that one's complicated. Yeah,
I do. I actually do want to tell people to read the book, because I actually think no matter how much we talk about it here, it doesn't do justice to the nuance and the layers of meaning within meaning within meaning without reading that. You can actually almost only convey that in the written form in some ways. But one thing about the example of this idea that you have to be self-aware, have truths that you know, I also wonder if it's at odds with the sort of Silicon Valley technologist culture of reality distortion fields, to use the phrase that Walter Isaacson used to describe Steve Jobs. But the other thing is we work in venture capital. We see founders every day. There's a certain will to power that you need to get through and punch through an industry that is hard to penetrate. And to me, it feels like you kind of have to have some lies that you tell yourself. So for me, it felt like a bit of a contradiction between lies and truth and being self-aware. Like, how can you be a founder and also self-aware at the same time? I mean, I don't mean to, it's like, it feels like they're at odds.
So I think you're kind of mixing two things.
Okay.
So look, when you talk about a reality distortion field, or like a founder who has a crazy idea or whatever, that's innovation. And so on those ideas, what you're really saying there is 99.999% of the world believes X and the founder believes Y. But when it's really a breakthrough, the founder's actually right. Mm-hmm. So these people were all deceived or thought they knew the truth but didn't, and the founder did. And that's always what innovation looks like. But that's believing something but not knowing it. Okay? And that's different than
that's a different thing.
Lying, where you know something and then you say something else to try and move things. That's like, it was why I hate the term fake it till you make it, because that's not what, lie to get what you want, fake it till you make it. Like that's got all kinds of bad cultural implications. That's going to come back and eat you alive in your own company if you're not careful. So I think that's not, those are two different concepts.
So I don't have to reconcile them.
I don't think you have to reconcile.
Yeah, I feel okay about that. So I'm going to do some quick lightning round style questions with you on a couple of things. So one is superstars, 10x engineers, brilliant jerks, other outliers in a company. When is cultural cohesion more important than those types of special, unique individuals and their performance? Like, is there a tension between the two?
Yeah, so almost all the time. However, look, there's sometimes, and John Madden had a great line on this. He said, look, on a football team, there's one guy that you can hold the bus for. Mm-hmm. Meaning, like, everybody's got to get to the game. There's one, maybe you can have one guy on the team who you can say, like, everybody's got to be on time, but that person is so great.
It's okay.
That we're going to hold the bus.
Yeah.
And the reason it can only be one is you have to make it clear to everybody else that you're going to let that person be outside the culture because they're just so ridiculous. Yeah.
They're a clear exception.
But you have to have great skill. Like John Madden was an amazing football coach and so forth. So generally you wouldn't do it, but if you want to do it, they better be the one.
Okay. So pirates versus Navy. And you've actually talked a lot in your other writings about wartime versus peacetime CEOs. I love that because it comes from The Godfather, the wartime, peacetime conciliary, one of my favorite movies of all time. By the way, I'm a big fan of Godfather 1, not Godfather 2, and there's two camps on that.
Godfather 2 is good.
It's good, but it's not great. It's not as good as Godfather 1. And Godfather 3, let's not even talk about.
Well, because you're an editor, Godfather 1, the editing was way tighter. I agree with that.
I agree. And I'm glad we agree, or somewhat on that. But Pirates versus Navy, is there a phase when every startup, it inevitably starts off as Pirates and becomes a Navy? How does someone navigate that cultural transition?
Yeah, so, there's a great story in Andy Grove's book, Only the Paranoid Survive, about this. So they were sort of, when they had the, the floating point error, which was like, and Andy Grove was like, it's not going to affect anybody. These guys are all stupid. F off, because Andy he didn't suffer fools. But it was a huge catastrophe for Intel. And what he said he learned, and it was kind of this transition from Pirates to the Navy, is, it doesn't matter, like when you're dealing with consumers, how they feel matters. Like these other things matter more than the actual technical answer. And so, he had to make that transition. I think another example, which he doesn't get credit for, but I think he made, is Mark Zuckerberg on Move Fast and Break Things. So they put that in place. It's a great shocking rule. It let everybody in the company know, we're going to run right by MySpace. Like, we're not messing around. And there are no excuses. Like, if you can break something, but I want you shipping. Like, let's go.
Yeah.
And it worked. But, they got to, then they tried to do, Facebook platform and have partners and Facebook Connect and all this stuff, and they kept breaking all their partners. And so they literally removed that, like, right out of the culture. And he consciously made that decision to move from one to another.
What did they update that to? Was it like move fast and break things, but have good infrastructure or something like that?
It was, I forgot what it was.
Some kind of version of that.
Yeah, but they definitely changed, and they got to a higher level of stability and all these kinds of things. But it was, it's something that I think anybody who achieves great success, a transition has to make. Yeah. But, great success.
I'm going to skip some of the other ones in the interest of time, just to wrap up, and so we have time for everyone's questions. I want to ask you about the process of writing the book, because, of course, as an editor, I have to know.
Yeah.
And also, frankly, before I met you and came to Andreessen Horowitz almost 6 years ago, I thought it was kind of shticky and gimmicky that you would put rap lyrics at the top of your blog post. I was like, no offense, I'm just going to say this out loud, but I'd be like, who is this like white guy putting rap lyrics on his post? And it's like a thing.
Judge me by my culture, not my color.
I agree. But I had that thought in my mind, and I was like, what's up with this? So tell me, and you also say in the book, I want to quote what you say. You said that the majority of your entrepreneurial and business and culture ideas occur to you when you're listening to hip hop. And so what I want to ask you, because now that I know you and I know that there's layers and layers of meanings behind what you do, what specifically about hip hop culture draws you, and what's the bigger cultural context for the rap lyrics that you put at the top of your blog posts?
Yeah, so rap music is very entrepreneurial in nature, and a lot of it has to do with, or not so much the more recent rap music as the original rap music, which is more entrepreneurial in nature, just because they created a new musical art form out of nothing, and nobody would put it on the radio, nobody would, MTV wouldn't play the videos, nobody would sign the guys for the first 10 years of rap music, nobody signed them, and so they did all these things. Ralph McDaniels created his own television show, like on public access, and played rap videos, and the guys there were all kinds of weird stories. I put some of them in the book. They sold records out of the trunks of their cars, that kind of thing. And they kind of built this whole thing that it ended up being, the biggest musical art form in the world currently. And so that story, and they tell those stories in the songs, and they're very related to the entrepreneurial journey. So I have a lot of those things in it. And then, and of course now I listen to so much rap music, a lot of other things come to mind. So if you think about the opening quote for the Culture and Revolution chapter, it's from Nas. So
one of your favorites?
Well, and a friend of mine who I spent hours and hours talking about the Haitian Revolution with, and he had a song on his album Stillmatic, the introduction to the album. And this album, you have to understand, his career, like, they had buried him, like he was dead. And Jay-Z came out with this like very aggressive diss rap against him, which he countered with a song called Ether. But the opening line is blood of a slave, heart of a king. And I was like, that's Toussaint Louverture, blood of a slave, heart of a king. And, and so those kinds of things. So it's kind of telling, it's the hidden story in the book. The rap lyric in the Shaka chapter from a young woman, Dej Loaf, really describes the culture he came from well, but she's also from Detroit. So these kinds of things. So it's just kind of the backstory on the book. It's how I tell that for the really avid readers.
But one of the things I've learned from you, and I agree, it's about judging a person based on their culture, not on their color, is that the way the influence of hip-hop is outsized in our culture. And you did an event with Dapper Dan, and that was a great example of how a man from Harlem, his design has influenced many, many, many other great designers. And there's a riffing culture, but sometimes it's also a stealing culture, borrowing culture, remix culture, that's TikTok. So I think what I love about it is that hip-hop has had an outsized cultural influence in our world today. And so I think it's very powerful that I described you as a builder of cultures, but a bridger of cultures. I think it's very powerful because you constantly bridge these cultures for us too, which I think is really, really important.
Yeah, and I think, so look, I want to go back to culture, not color, because that actually comes from something that Toussaint did. So in 1797, he was actually running the colony as part of France.
Yeah.
And there was a guy, Vincent Vaublanc, who hated the idea of a slave running a French colony, and he lobbied the French Parliament. He said, look, the colony's been overrun by ignorant and brutish Negroes. And Toussaint had to counter this argument. And the counter argument was really interesting because he said, look, black people are not savages. It's slavery that makes them so. And then he went on to basically break down point by point why the Haitian Revolution was far less bloody and brutal and savage than the French Revolution. And some of the things I talked about, like they didn't pillage, made his case, and he won that argument with the French Parliament. But it was so interesting to me the way he phrased it, because it was the culture of slavery that created the perception of these guys that had nothing to do with it. It just got a color assigned to it. And I think that, with hip-hop, it's the culture of entrepreneurship.
Yes.
And it has nothing to do with being black. It has to do with that culture, and that's why I think that a lot of entrepreneurs resonate with it. And, we get divided up into these dumb demographics, age, gender, color, zip code. But, what you do is who you are.
Yeah.
That's your culture.
That's fantastic. I want to say to everyone, thank you for joining this episode of the A16Z podcast. But this is great.
This is not the A16Z
No,
podcast.
it's not. We're here at the Computer History Museum, and thank you again, everyone, for hosting us. And now I'm going to ask some of the questions that came from the audience. Some of these have names, some don't. So the first question is, Ben, given the importance of culture in any organization, how would you evaluate candidates for culture fit?
Yes, I think that's very tricky because people can change their culture. And so, you don't want to... So one thing that you can get with exact culture fit is a lot of homogeneity, right? We went to the same school, we read the same books, we believe the same things, and there's a power in that, but it's a slippery thing, so you have to be careful. So what I find to be powerful is to really define your culture. And, we have a very comprehensive culture document at the firm.
We have the
and one of the
values
things that we do, which actually I learned while writing the book, is we don't let anybody sign their offer letter without agreeing to the culture, saying, I'm going to live in this culture, I'm going to adhere to these standards. And it has to be specific, not fuzzy. So, if somebody says, oh, they're not a culture fit, it's like, why? What exactly about them doesn't fit into our culture? And is that an element we want in our culture or not want? And, you have to be able to have the conversation at that level. And so I would just say, doing it in a fuzzy way is very dangerous. Doing it in a specific, intentional way and knowing that people can change, I would say, would be the correct approach.
This is a follow-up related question from another person, just kind of theming these. You talked about building culture. What do you do if you walk into, this is now from the employee perspective, what do you do if you walk into a new company and you find yourself a misfit in terms of culture? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I'm very curious for what you think about that.
Well, look, if you don't believe in the behaviors of that company and you're coming in at the individual contributor level, you probably want to move on. I think it's very difficult because what will end up happening is that culture will change you. And I know a lot of you have probably worked in organizations where, people berate each other. And then what happens, right? Like if you're in that, like you'll go home and do that. And like you'll pick that up. And so you don't do that to yourself. Like if you're not with the environment that you're in, don't become a person you don't want to be.
I would also add to that, because I've heard this from you so many times, and it's in our values too, that we celebrate difference. It shouldn't be, the assumption should not be that someone following a code means that everyone's in the same cult mindset. Like there's room for a variety of people and different ways of being.
Yeah, so, and we talk about it at the firm, which is what I always say is, look, if you have an NFL team, you're going to have players that weigh 350 pounds, and you're going to have players that weigh like 180 pounds and run fast. And like, if you have all 350-pound players, you're going to lose. And if you have all skinny guys who run fast, you're going to lose. And so we have to value each other's strengths. And it can't always be like, I only value the strengths that I have. And that's basically where people screw up the whole diversity and inclusion equation is they can't see the talents that they don't have. And so then they try and use a proxy like race or gender or whatever. When, like, if you could see the talent, like, you'll get diversity. You just have to be able to see what people can do. And I talk about this a lot in the book, but, that really is important. But you have to see and value
who they
the
really
things
are.
that you can't do. Right.
Yeah. So this is also related. I don't know if you have a different thought on this angle. What can I do to change a culture at my company as a rank and file employee? Like, do they go to HR? Do they talk to someone? What advice would you have for this person?
Well, to change the culture.
Yeah, how can they change it from that perspective?
I think the thing that's different in companies versus a society, like in society, like Jay-Z can change the culture.
Yeah.
Companies, the hierarchy has a heavier weighting to it. So if let's say you wanted to change the culture so that everybody was, on time and respectful of each other's time, and the CEO always showed up to everything a half hour late, like it'd be really hard to do. And so I think that if you're an individual coming in, you kind of have to compel the top of the organization to do it for starters. Otherwise, like, you're just going to be fighting the tide.
Yeah, that's actually great. And I have to say, I actually appreciate that you're someone that I can come walk into your office and tell you the truth of what I'm thinking, and you don't actually get mad at me for that.
And then, as a leader, on the other hand, like, everybody's culture is broken in some way. Like, I've never met a company that has anything close to 100% cultural coherence. Like, and people who tell you they have are just literally don't even know. They're lying to themselves.
They're full of shit.
Like, it is so, look, it's in mathematical terms, it's a complex, adaptive, path-dependent system. Like, everybody's behavior is moving the culture all the time, and you're going to have breakage, and you're going to have slippage, and you're going to have regressions, and all that kind of stuff. And you're doing the best you can to, like, move it in the right direction. So as a leader, if somebody says, like, I think we have a cultural problem, you can't tell them to pound sand. Or, like, you can, but, like, you are going to, that thing is going to fester and grow. We call that a kimchi problem. The deeper you bury it, the hotter it gets.
That's great.
For my Korean friends.
It's funny, too, because you say in the book, I love this, that the goal is to be better, not perfect, which I think is a much more attainable thing for someone to do, which I loved. So here's another employee-oriented question. How can I evaluate company culture before I join? How can you tell from the outside if you don't have a culture doc and the kinds of things that we and others do?
Well, like, I think you have to ask specific questions about the kinds of, behaviors that you're concerned about.
Yeah.
And people won't, like, if you ask about a behavior, people won't know even to try and, like, head fake you on it. Like, if I send somebody an email here, like, how long will it take to get back to me? Like, that's a very telling thing in a culture, right? Like, because people are either responsive or they're not. if I go to a meeting, are people going to be listening to me, or are they going to be like on their phones and
Laptops.
computers?
Yeah.
Because different companies run differently that way. And so you just have to think about, okay, where are you going to be effective, and what are the behaviors that like you want to be part of, and what is going to drive you bananas?
Right. Oh my God, I love this question. In the blood genealogy story, you mentioned the samurai was a mediocre performer.
Yeah.
How do you decide whether or not to keep that mediocre performer without he or she having to demonstrate value in such an extreme way in an extreme situation?
Yeah, you know.
I love that question.
That's a great question.
Raise your hand,
it's
whoever asked
interesting
that.
because in the story, if you'll recall, Lord Soma really had an affinity for the samurai despite all his issues. And so, you know, like, and I think a lot of times, and I always say, one of the things I really believe in is you value people on the magnitude of their strength, not their lack of weakness, and that's in kind of hiring and as you go forward. The late Raiders owner used to say something I really like. It's just coach them on what they can do. Like, not everybody can do everything, but like if what they can do is world class, and you need that, then that's a real thing. And, you know, he was world class at one thing. Like, you could count on him. Like, he would do his level best at whatever you needed him to do, 100%. And, you know, that shows up more than just when he went and got the genealogy. So, you know, it's how you look at people. Now, and I would always rather have somebody world-class at something that I really needed than, like, above average at everything. And, you know, and horrible at something else. And we have people in the firm like that, as you know, like, and I value that. And I'm okay. And you do have to have that conversation. No, you can't go do that job because you're no good at that.
Well, I love that about
I have
our
you
firm.
in this job.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that we're all really honest about that and we allow that. I have because we talked about Godfather earlier, I have to say that I call this my capo theory of management, which is that there's a capo layer in every company. And I sometimes wonder to myself, that kind of loyalty, does it actually really pay off? Like sometimes what I love about that question that person asked was, it almost made me wonder, like, I don't want to be that blood genealogy person. Like, I'd rather be excellent at something than mediocre and have to prove myself that way, but not everyone, I don't know, I just, you know, anyway.
That was a real test. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a great one. As an investor and board member, this is kind of a governance related thing. How do you keep your company management responsible on the question of culture? Is it something that you actually even ask? Like, is it around processes, KPIs, priority versus profit? Does it come up at a board level?
Yes, and no, look, it does, at least it does for me, because I spend a lot of time, at least with the CEOs in my portfolio, talking to them about, you know, what it means to, and it starts with hiring. Like, let's not, I don't care about like your close rate on your candidates and all that right now. What I want to know is, how are you onboarding them? How long does it take them to get productive? What is your employee satisfaction? What are your attrition rates? And this is the biggest mistake people make on diversity, is they measure how many women, underrepresented minorities are coming through the door.
Yeah.
That's not the metric. The metric is, what do promotion, attrition, employee satisfaction look like across race and gender?
Yeah.
Like, can you see the talent? Do you value it? Do people enjoy their career there? Because if they do, then you can get the talent. But if you don't recognize the talent and you just force people in so you can get the gold sticker from the New York Times that says you're not racist and sexist, then you're going to make everybody miserable, all your employees. So anyway, sorry.
That's great. No. Okay, a couple more and then we can wrap up in a minute or two, and a few minutes because we have time for these. If you could be world-class at only one thing, culture or product, which do you choose and why? And by the way, for those in the audience who haven't read this book, one of the recurring themes Ben does talk about is this tension that culture is this abstract thing. So how do you make those choices? I love this question.
So look.
From Dennis and San Mateo, by the way.
Let's not get confused about one thing. You can have a great culture and you build a product that like people don't want, your company's going out of business. Nobody's going to ever, like, that's that. So like the product has to work for you to have a business. But having said that, and I talk to entrepreneurs about this all the time, the most important thing about your company isn't necessarily going to be the success or the deals you won or like the customers you had. It's going to be what that time was like. You know, that time of your life and the life of all the employees who spent most of their waking hours with you at your company. What did that feel like? How did you treat each other? How did you treat the people you work with? Did everybody's lives get better? Did they become better people or worse people? And that's your culture. And so that's like a real thing with incredible value. So I don't want to say, you know, just because you can't succeed through culture alone doesn't mean it's not incredibly important.
Okay, so last one. If starting a VC fund like A6 and Z today, what would be the most important to build the right culture?
Well, you know, like it depends what your business strategy is. And this is, not every culture is for everybody. And one of my favorite examples that I have in the book is, so you take Amazon. Amazon, one of their cultural things is frugality. Like they're famous for like, they really watch the money. And, you know, they used to have, your desk used to be a door, like in the old days at Amazon.
Like a trestle table.
So just to let you know, we're not going to buy you a desk. That's how cheap we are. But their business strategy was to be the low-cost leader. So that from a customer perspective, if I went to Amazon, I didn't even have to price compare because I knew they had the lowest cost. And to get to that, you need to not waste money. You contrast that with Apple. Apple doesn't have that strategy. They're not trying to be the low-cost, low-price leader. They're trying to build the best product possible, the most beautiful, best designed, spare no expense. Steve Jobs even got fired by sparing no expense his first time around. And so, like, you go to their campus, it like costs $5 billion, and it's like gorgeous, and the doorknobs cost like thousands of dollars, all that kind of thing. And that works for them. You know, that culture kind of produced the products that they produce, and Apple's products probably will always be more beautiful than Amazon's products, which are not very beautiful. But they'll also always be more expensive. And so that culture was right for Apple, and the other culture was right for Amazon. So, you know, and for Apple to take Amazon's culture wouldn't have been productive for them because it didn't go with their business strategy.
That's great. So I have one last question for you, and it adds a question that the Computer History Museum asked us to do as well. But so you made the bestseller list, and it's in the category for advice and how-to, which I personally love. The business category is not out yet, so we don't know where it is there. I'm sure it'll be. But I love that because I found the book very therapeutic in reading it, and there's something about personal development as well as career development and leadership in it. On that note, for you, sitting where you are today, knowing everything you know now, and what you could tell your younger self, the Computer History Museum has a one-word initiative where they ask you to reveal one word of advice to a young person, and it could be for yourself or to any young person today. Could you share what your word is and the story behind it?
Sure. Now, do I have it here?
It's right here.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't even know what it is.
So, I don't know if you can read it. It's persistence. And this is for entrepreneurs. Yeah, this is for entrepreneurs. Because, look, entrepreneurship makes you want to quit all the time. And, you know, from fundraising to, like, everything going wrong to problems with customers to your employees telling you your culture sucks. And, like, if you're not absolutely committed to getting better and learning and changing and making it go, then you're not going to get there. And, and if you think about the top entrepreneurs, like, they are amazingly persistent people.
I would say that entrepreneurship is also a thing for life. Like, this is something that I think if you want anything in life, this is what you need. Thank you, everyone, for coming today and joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Ben. Everyone, we'll have book signing downstairs. Thank you all for coming. And Ben, thank you very much for your lessons learned. Thanks. Bye-bye.